Thank you so much for the opportunity to share my work and some thought. And let's see. So I'd like to start with the soils as a component of shaping the morphology of the landscapes. As you see here, you have a soil-covered hill slope, and the soil basically overlies the underlying bedrock. And then if we want to follow the trajectory of the ground surface elevation, that elevation is basically changing according to the change of elevation at the soil bedrock boundary and also the thickness of the soils. So at the boundary of the soil and bedrock, that elevation is going to be affected by uplift rate and the soil production. But at the same time, the mass of the soils will be determined by the balance of soil production and then the mass loss by soil erosion and chemical weathering. Okay, but if I go to other conferences like the Soil Science Society of America or Ecological Society of America, or most of our department seminars, and I start talking about soils as a carbon reservoir, and the soils are such a very important reservoir of carbon that has a big impact on the global carbon cycle. So within this community of soil carbon cycle, the big question is how much of a soil carbon is actually associated with the minerals. And if you dig up the soils and look at the organic matter, you will quickly find that some organic matter are not really combined with the minerals, but there are also significant pool of organic matter that are tightly combined with the minerals by basically being sorbed onto the mineral surface or by being occluded in the aggregates. So they also have their own models. So this is a very simple and incorrect in many ways view of the soil organic carbon. So soil organic carbon can be considered as a sum of a particulate organic carbon, which is described as POC here, and also mineral associated carbon, which is described as MAOC. And they have their own inputs and their own decay rates. But the soils are often very hard to really differentiate the two, and then it's very hard to really define where those two clearly split. So many of the experimental work to quantify those separate pools and depend on very operational experimental measurement. And then those two pools are also connected because of the microbes. So here, some of the particular organic pool carbon will be consumed by microbes, and the microbes die, and then some of those dead masses or alive masses, biomasses of microbes can be sequestered into the mineral-associated carbon. So in my talk today, I'd like to make two arguments, and the first argument is that this soil carbon cycle actually matters to the elevation of the ground surface. So the morphology of the landscape is somehow connected to what is happening to the organic matter in the soils. That's the first argument I like to make. And the second argument I'm going to make is that earthworms really highlight it. So you can see this example of connection between carbon cycle and the ground surface elevation through the action of the earthworms. And let's see. So I'm going back to about 10,000 years when the glacier covered much of the North America. So when the glacier retreated and forest and prairie followed, and then this is what the forest floor used to look like before earthworms caught up. So if you go into deciduous forests that are very common in Minnesota, like a sugar maple or basswood forest, then you will see that there is tons of understory plants, and as you walk in, you will also find that ground surface is very soft because they are covered with a thick O-horizon. Okay, what's going on here? Okay. But once earthworms arrive, then much of those understory plants disappear and are being replaced by graminoid and grass types plants. And then also the O-horizon, or the leaf layer, quickly disappears. So, and this is the two data from a very different environment. The top one is from Abisko, Sweden, the first national park in the country. And the second one is from North Central Forest in Minnesota. So here in the x-axis, you see the distance. So that's basically distance from the point where we believe earthworms were introduced into the forest. So earthworms are moving into the forest. In the Minnesota case, it has advanced about 200 meters. In Abisko case, it has advanced about 1 kilometer. And then there are two y-axes, and the green one showing the leaf litter thickness or leaf litter biomass, and the dark one is showing the earthworm biomass. So here, earthworms are the dark forces, kind of eating into the forest and consuming the organic layer. So by monitoring this speed, and also by dividing the length of earthworm invasion chronosequence by the speed of their movement, we can also tell how long this site has been invaded. So from those research, we know that earthworms, if they are left alone, they advance about 5 to 10 meters per year. So from here and most to the end of this classroom. So if you multiply 10,000 years with that rate, you can go about 50 kilometers to 100 kilometers. So it's very insignificant in the scheme of the continent. So much of the North America basically stayed without native earthworms for last 10,000 years or so. So when I first studying the earthworm invasion in Minnesota, I met with Ojibwe tribe people in the Litchfield Lake, and some of the young one of the young people there told me that his grandfather had told him that earthworms came with white people. So they had been aware of this for a long time, but now scientists arrived and then got surprised. So then I was very curious about whether Ojibwe language actually record anything about it. And so before our last Ojibwe linguist retire, I asked John Nichol, who used to be in the American Indian Department here, whether Ojibwe language has any term for the earthworms. And this is the response I got. But then he also told me that he had been always curious why Ojibwe language doesn't have a term for earthworms. And then when he heard this from those descriptive words, and his kind of conjecture was that probably earthworms was invasive species or someone introduced the species, but he couldn't believe it himself. So going back to our questions. So let's think of soil thickness and then being governed by those factors. So let's say earthworms just arrive. Then what do you think is going to happen? Do you expect expansion of the soil, or do you expect collapse of the soil? So do you see epsilon as a positive sign or negative sign? So keep your thinking, and you may write down and whether you will be surprised or not. So one thing that is really surprising about these earthworms is that wherever they invade, they basically do the same thing and over again. And then that is that basically they remove the organic horizon, the leaf layer, and then they create this topsoil, mineral rich, but also organic rich topsoil, which we call A horizon. So another way of saying it is that they replace the O horizon with A horizon. And that seems to be happening everywhere, from Sweden and Finland, in Minnesota and Alaska, everywhere that we have visited. So if you think of this from carbon's perspective, and you can see two things. One is, and very contrasting things, you can see earthworms as very vigorous death herbivore, and then they come and they arrive, and then they remove that litter layer within a matter of 5 years to a decade. So they turn soil into carbon source by removing the O horizon. But that's when you really focus on the litter layer. But let's say you don't care about the O horizon, but you care about the mineral soil, then you are going to see the opposite thing. So you will see earthworms as animals that are very strong bioturbators and the mixing organic matter and the minerals together and create what we like to see, the mineral-associated organic carbon that turn over slowly. So then you will be tempted to say, earthworms are probably helping soils to sequester carbon. So here is the carbon concentration data from different parts of the world, boreal, Arctic, and temperate. And then you may see the decrease of the carbon concentrations from pre-invasion to post-invasion. But you are not actually seeing the decrease of the carbon storage here because you're only seeing the decrease of carbon concentration. To really get the storage, you have to multiply those concentrations by the bulk density. So, and also there's horizon changes. So those white circles, which describe the no-warm situation, you have very high carbon concentration, making them O horizons. And those O horizons will be later replaced by A horizon now, taking the surface of the soil. Their carbon concentration is smaller, but they are denser. So you can see this again, depending on whether you look at the O horizon or A horizon, you can see it as a carbon sink or carbon source. So now let's look at the bulk density. So here, there's a really nice relationship between organic matter fraction in the soils and the bulk density. So, but wherever we go and wherever we collect organic matter fractions and the bulk density data, they follow this nice nonlinear trend that you reduce the organic matter content, then you increase the bulk density. And then we find this from several different earthworm invasion chronosequence. But also another thing that is important is that it also matches with much larger collection of the data that shows the relationship between organic matter fraction and the bulk density. So here, basically, I'm not really telling you which direction the system is moving because that also depends on whether you look at the O horizon or A horizon. So if you're looking at the O horizon, you will see the organic matter fraction decrease and the bulk density increase. But if you look at the A horizon, then your organic matter fraction will increase and the bulk density will decrease. So there are both directions in this diagram. So the one way to resolve this, to really focus on the volumetric changes, is to normalize all the concentrations to something immobile, that we trust that this particular element doesn't get washed down by leaching or doesn't get introduced into the soil by biological carbon cycles. And one of those candidates is zirconium. So by combining zirconium concentrations in the soil versus their parent material, and also by comparing their bulk densities, that we can calculate epsilon, which is volumetric dilation factor. So if epsilon is 0, that means your soil has gone through no change in volume during the formation and in comparison to the parent material. But if epsilon is 8, that means soil is basically containing 800% of the volume that its parent material used to have. So if it is -1, then basically volume has disappeared. So here, the x-axis is epsilon values, and the y-axis is soil. And then there are 3 categories in the pre-invasion and the intermediate invasion, and then also intensively invaded region. So before the earthworm invasion, because of the O horizons, that you have dramatically volumetrically expanded soil. So it's 800% volumetric expansion. But then once earthworms arrive, then the volumetric expansion decreased quite dramatically to 100%. So kind of going back to earlier question, so earthworms they tend to decrease the existing volumetric expansion before their arrivals. But this is just one example, because depending on which stage of earthworm invasion you sample, and also depending on what kind of earthworms are invading at the place, and you may have different signs. So this is just take this as one possible outcomes of the volumetric change in the soils due to earthworm invasion here. Okay, so now I'm going to do a very simple experiment, very simple mass balance modeling to test or highlight the idea that the carbon cycle, and then which is in this case strongly mediated by earthworm invasion, has a big capacity to modulate the thickness of the soils, and also by doing so, the elevation of the ground surface. So there's two scenarios here. One scenario is that earthworms are really strong detritivores, so they can lead up all horizons. That's the model focus. The second case, it focused on the scenario that earthworms are actually more than detritivores, so they actually create a significant mineral-associated organic carbon. So under the hood of the models, there is 3 horizons, and then all horizons, and then also the root layer and the mineral horizon that is going to turn to 8 horizons. And then earthworms are being introduced at a certain point of the time, and then they eat some of the plant leaf litter, and then they also eat some of the fine roots, and then they transfer those carbon into the soil. And at the same time, they partition the soil carbon into 2 different poles that are turning at different speed. And also there is a bioturbation happening between the root layer and the underlying mineral soils. So 2 scenarios. X-axis here is time relativity invasion. So we are only simulating 50 years because that's how much we know about what is happening in the field. And the y-axis shows basically the entire soil carbon pool. So if you have earthworms as detritivores, scenario 1, which is red, then your carbon storage decreases quite rapidly, and then by 20 years, you lose most of the carbon in the system. But if you have earthworms as producer of the mineral-associated carbon that is turning up slowly, then your total carbon store will increase. But that's not really surprising because that's how we set up the model. But now let's think about some difference between geochemists or ecologists and geomorphologists. In my view, and the geochemists are very much concerned about how much things are here at certain locations. So we care about the mass of something per square area. But if I talk to geomorphologists, and they care about the elevation, so they care about the volume of the materials per given areas. And then, so if we want to go back and forth, we need a conversion factor. We need a conversion factor that makes us to do the unit change. And in this case, the bulk density is the key. So I'm going back to this one. So we have a really nice relationship between organic matter fraction and bulk density, which means that if I can track down how the organic matter concentration in the soil change, then we can simulate how the bulk density will change. And by doing so, then I can change the mass carbon per square meter or mass soil per square meter to the thickness of that layer, and which can lend me to the elevation of the ground surface. So, so this is the result. So if you look at the Earth surface, land surface elevation in comparison to the pre-earthworm invasion, and depending on whether you have earthworms as detritivores or you have earthworms as a creator of the mineral-associated carbon, your ground surface will evolve differently. Plus minus 10 or 20 centimeter in 20 years or 50 years. and that is a lot faster than millimeter per year or meter per million years. So, but then we don't really know how long it will last. But kind of going back to the bulk density, we can go a little further. So when you combine bulk density with the particle density of the minerals and the particle density of organic matter, then you can calculate the porosity. So you can also model how the porosity will evolve with the invasion of the earthworms. And then this is the results. So two scenarios again. At the time zero, those two scenarios kind of converge. And then as time goes on, by 10 years, those two scenarios diverge. And then the red line, which simulate the earthworms as detritivores, showing the thinner soil and then less porosity. But in contrast, where your earthworms create the mineral-associated carbon, you have a thickening soil, but also its porosity increase quite dramatically. So here, I showed you modeling result only up to 50 years, which is really short time compared to the most presentation that we have seen so far. And the reason being that we don't really know what is going to happen after 50 years of earthworm invasion. So there could be very different scenarios. For example, the biomass of earthworms, biomass of the European earthworms we see in Alaska and Minnesota are way higher than those biomass in their origins, like Southern Europe. And then we also have a new invasion of jumping worms, and those are of Asian origin. And then they really changed the soils within a couple of years. And then they also show tremendously higher population density than those they show in their kind of home countries like China or Korea and Japan. So we don't really know whether their population level will slow down. And we also don't know how their perturbation of biogeochemistry by accelerating organic matter can change the nitrogen cycle or phosphorus cycle. In the case that they can help the slow release of the nitrogen, they may solve the problem with nitrogen limitation for a certain time and boost the plant production, which will bring in a more leaf litter into the soils, and that will lead to the more organic matter in the soils. And also we have a very limited data that stretches beyond 30 years. And then those limited data seem to suggest that earthworms are getting more effective in creating mineral-associated organic carbon, but that we don't really know, what is really truly happening beyond the 50 years. I think that is a fair assessment. So here, I hope I convinced you that the earthworms are important, and in that their kind of introduction into a system can change the porosity and also the volume of the soils quite dramatically, enough to change the elevation of the ground surface. And that also has implications for soil erosion, because the first thing is that when earthworms arrive, they can lead of all horizons, which means they are getting rid of this protective layer that protects the mineral surface from the rain splash or from the overland flow. So they may have a negative impact or kind of accelerate the soil erosion. And also this modeling and some field data show that earthworms in certain cases can dramatically decrease the porosity of the soils, which may elevate the occurrences of the overland flow that can also leading to accelerate the erosion. So Nate, my students presented the poster. So if you have visited with Nate, that Nate had some data to show you the erosion rate change with earthworms. So I will leave you with some potential discussion topics, and I also like to acknowledge my graduate students, Neil Lund, and Adrian Wackett, Sarah Bauer, Tyler Bowman, Kit Resnoy, and Amy Little, who all contributed to understanding the impact of earthworms in the forest in Minnesota and Alaska. And thank you.